Hey everyone, Benchy here from Benching&Gaming. Today we're going to be taking a look at this, the Celeron 420, which had its initial release for LGA 775 socket motherboards back on the 5th of June 2007 at a price of only $39 US, which even by today's standards is a fantastic price for a processor. Putting aside the fact that it's only running at 1.6 GHz and that it's only a single core processor with no hyperthreading. But given that this is now 12 years old and, like I said, it's a single core processor, does it perform just as badly as you're expecting in gaming? Well, you're going to have to stay tuned to find out. Back when it was initially launched, it was never intended for gaming. It was aimed purely at the value market, intended only ever for general tasks that required very little power to complete. But personally, I kind of find it hilarious testing older, low-power CPUs like this. That aside, like I mentioned in the intro, the 420 initially launched at a price of only $39 US, or around $48 US today, adjusting for inflation. It's also the equivalent of around £40 or €44, barring any country's relevant taxes. I managed to pick it up for only 25 pence at CEX here in the UK, although it is out of stock just now on their website, and it isn't really worth it for what you'd pay on eBay UK. In the US though, you'll be paying around $3.99 on eBay over there. Prices aside, let's run through the specs of the 420 itself. The 35W TDP single-core Celeron 420 ran at only 1.6 GHz and had a front-side bus speed of 800 MHz. It's based on the conroe-L architecture and is part of the Conroe family, which were the first CPUs to be based on Intel's Core architecture. It had 105 million transistors built on the 65nm fabrication process, and had 64 KB of L1 cache and 512 KB of L2 cache, a minuscule amount by today's standards. For the test today, I do normally include GTA 5 as part of the game tests, but unfortunately I've had to drop it for this video due to Steam and its infinite wisdom deciding to delete the entire game when I tried to verify files and when I transferred the game over from another PC. Small rant aside though, let's have a look at some of the specs of the rest of the system the 420 will be used with, which features a Gigabyte GA-EP45-DS3L motherboard with 8GB of DDR2 RAM running at 800 MHz. A MSI GTX 1080 Armor OC Edition graphics card for my personal system to eliminate any chance of bottlenecking, Windows 7 Ultimate 64-bit, and a Phanteks TC14PE cooler. All of the games are being run from a mechanical hard drive separate from the hard drive the OS is on, so let's get on with the tests. To kick off the test for today, I'm running the 420 through Cinebench R20. I'll be running the benchmark a total of 3 times and averaging out the scores as usual to get a fair representation of what the 420 can reliably manage. Given that it is only a single core processor, you can expect some pretty poor results, and a poor result it achieved. At the stock speed of 1.6 GHz, it only managed scores of 62, 61 and 61 points for the 3 runs respectively, for an average score of 61.33 points. To give the score a little perspective, the Core 2 Quad Q8300 that I tested previously is 837.55% faster than this at stock clocks. Overclocking wise though, and here's where it gets exciting. Numerous sources online claimed an overclock as high as 3.2 GHz, 100% over stock, but I managed to get a clock speed of 3.12 GHz with a frontside bus speed of 390 MHz. Any higher was unstable, which needed a voltage of 1.425 volts in the BIOS, 1.392 volts actual, to be stable. This also had the RAM now running at a speed of 936 MHz. I'll put the rest of the settings down in the description below. Despite not managing as high as a clock as I was hoping for, it's still a massive 93.83% increase over stock. And with this massive overclock came a pretty decent increase in scores, albeit still nothing to write home about, with scores of 101, 102 and 101 points for the 3 runs respectively, for an average score of 101.33 points, a 65.22% increase in score. Moving on to the physics portion of FreedomArc's Firestrike benchmark, I'm also running the test a total of 3 times and taking an average from the 3 scores to give a fair representation of what the 420 can manage in this benchmark. The overclock manages an even bigger increase in scores than it did in Cinebench, but let's get the stock scores out of the way first though, which were 486, 486 and 487 points for the 3 runs respectively, giving an average score of 486.33 points. there was a near 100% increase in scores once overclocked, 97.95% increase in average scores to be exact, and the 420 was now able to spit out 3 runs of 954, 966 and 968 points respectively, giving an average score of 962.67 points. With GTA 5 off the table due to the issues I mentioned earlier, first up is on to CSGO, which I'm running at 1080p on the lowest settings possible to give the 420 the best possible chance, and I'm also running the test in a hard difficulty competitive bot match on the Mirage map. I wasn't exactly expecting much considering the 420 is a single core CPU running at only 1.6 GHz, so it was never going to blaze through the game with no issues, but it was still a bit of a horror show to be honest. I need to point out though that for the overclock test, an increase in voltage to 1.45 volts in the BIOS, 1.408 to 1.424 volts actual, was needed to maintain stability. Stock clocks even had major stuttering and input lag in the menu before actually getting into the match, although the overclock improved on this massively, but still had moments of noticeable stutter. The audio was also really stuttery at stock clocks too. As you can see from the gameplay footage, the overclock did manage to improve performance massively throughout, although it definitely still had its issues. FPS in both tests dropped into the single figures with lows as bad as 4 FPS at stock, and the more respectable but still awful 8 frames per second low with the overclock. The video obviously doesn't need me to tell you how bad the stutter was at stock, given just how blatantly obvious it is, and to be blunt, it was shocking. Combat was also an issue in both tests, as they were both affected pretty badly by the level of stutter, more so with stock clocks, but still pretty noticeable in the overclock test. Another major issue I noticed at stock is that the game appears to run slower than it should at times, although the overclock seemed to fix this, as well as the audio stutter I noticed at stock clocks. The benchmark for stock showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 10, 4 and a measly 2 FPS respectively. There were a huge amount of spikes in frame times up to around 360 milliseconds throughout, and more of up to 530 milliseconds at the worst. The overclock managed 21, 8 and only 4 FPS for its average 1% and 0.1% lows respectively, a huge improvement over stock but still nowhere near being playable. Next, we're moving on to Skyrim, specifically the original version of the game released back in 2011 and not the remastered version released a few years back. I'm also running this at 1080p on the lowest settings possible. I was actually expecting this to perform worse than CSGO, despite being an older game, only by a year though, but I was still expecting worse performance. It actually performed better than CSGO did to my surprise, but that's not to say it's without its issues, as I'm sure you've noticed by now. On the run into Riverwood near the start of the game, the 420 can manage figures into the mid-20s FPS wise at stock clocks, and with a very noticeable amount of stuttering and lows as bad as 9 FPS and a pretty major lockup when getting into Riverwood, it all made for a reasonably jarring experience overall. The overclock pushed the highs up into the high 30s but dropped a little further down to only 7. The stutter was improved massively though. There were noticeable moments of stutter and brief lockups in the Riverwood Trader at stock clocks, and FPS around the 14 to 26 range. The overclock though didn't seem to have any noticeable stutter here at all, although it could still dip into the mid-20s FPS wise. Performance was also pretty bad on the route towards Bleak Falls Barrow and the Temple. Stock clocks could only manage to get into the mid-20s FPS wise, but had noticeable stutter, which is especially apparent when turning the camera. The overclock has some very brief lockups but appear to run relatively smoothly here. In the temple itself though, there were parts of it in which stock clocks, to my surprise, actually appeared to run relatively smoothly, but that didn't last for long at all, and there was still noticeable stuttering at parts throughout it. The overclock had far less stutter thankfully, but did still have moments where it was fairly noticeable, with some very brief lockups as well. The benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 29, 9 and 3 FPS respectively at stock clocks, with a huge amount of spikes in frame times throughout the test of up to around 140 milliseconds, a lot more reaching up to around 280 milliseconds, more of around 1.1 seconds, and the worst spike which was 3.86 seconds. The overclock showed a more respectable 33 FPS for its average, but a still fairly poor 16 and 7 FPS for its 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. It also had a large amount of spikes throughout the test of up to around 60 milliseconds, several more around the 120 to 200 milliseconds mark, and more of around 420 up to as high as 700 milliseconds. I'd also like to point out that there were points during both tests in which some objects didn't render at all. And to close out the test for today, it's Warframe, released back in 2013, which, like the other games, I ran at 1080p using the lowest settings possible. Before moving on with the test, I need to point out that this footage was captured before the latest hotfix, which was literally released the minute I finished the Overclock test. As I'm sure you've realised by now, there was never going to be a game in this video in which the 420 would get pretty high FPS figures, and Warframe was no different. On the Landercraft, FPS was as low as 18 at stock clocks, with highs of around 51 in the least detailed area, but there was very noticeable stuttering here with some very brief but noticeable lockups happening too. The Overclock though improved the stuttering massively, but it was still noticeable at times, with one severe lockup happening here. It also had improved lows of around 26 FPS and highs of 76, but that isn't exactly representative of the rest of the game. During the mission itself, which was a survival mission on Jupiter, performance was nowhere near what it was in the Landercraft in either test. Stock had FPS dropping as low as 7 frames per second, but managed highs of around 40 FPS in the least detailed areas of the map with no enemies around you. The Overclock did manage to improve on the lows, with around 14 FPS at worst, and pushed the highs up to around 65, but also in the least detailed areas. Both tests had fairly noticeable stutter throughout the whole test, with stock clocks being far worse. Stock also had major lockups at times, as well as the game itself running far slower than it should have been. The Overclock didn't seem to have this issue though, but as mentioned still has moments of fairly noticeable stuttering, and there were also one or two occasions where there were severe lockups as well. Overall though, the Overclock ran far smoother than stock clocks did. The benchmark for stock showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 12, 7 and 3 FPS respectively, with spikes in frame times throughout of up to around 140 milliseconds, more of around 220 to 300 milliseconds, some reaching 600 milliseconds and the worst being a huge 3.12 seconds. The Overclock improved on this massively, but still had reasonably low average 1% and 0.1% lows of 19, 10 and 6 FPS respectively, with a lot of spikes throughout the test of up to around 80 milliseconds, several more up to around 140 milliseconds, more up to around 260 milliseconds and the worst being 2 seconds. So yeah, now that the tests are done, obviously it was never going to get any kind of respectable FPS at all. It was never going to blaze through any of the games whatsoever. But to me, that's kind of the fun of testing a processor like this, is being able to laugh at just how horribly bad the performance is. But yeah, I'm pretty disappointed I wasn't able to test GTA 5, but that was no fault of my own. That was Steam's problem. Hopefully I'll have that sorted for the next video though. But with the likes of Skyrim, Warframe and CSGO, performance was pretty poor at stock clocks, and with the massive near 100% overclock, it obviously improved the performance massively, but still not to the point where it was completely comfortable experience. But then again, if this processor is all you have and you can't afford to upgrade to anything, then I suppose there's some people out there who could probably put up with it. But yeah, the performance was pretty poor, to be honest. Before we finish up today, I'd like to give a special shout out to Patreon supporter TazVDodge, or @TazVDodge on Twitter, for making all of this possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment or a like and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos through my Patreon at patreon.com/Benching&Gaming, or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Benching&Gaming. But thanks for watching my video. It means a lot that you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.